This little guest house might not look like much, just a cozy structure at the back of my property, built decades ago and recently restored. But to the HOA, it was an eyesore, an unauthorized dwelling, and a threat to their tightly controlled narrative. So one morning, I found a bright red cease and desist letter taped to the guest house door, demanding I shut it down immediately. What they didn't know, the house was sitting on a sliver of land they had no legal authority over, a forgotten boundary line buried in city records and old plat maps. They thought they were flexing their rules. But all they did was wake up the one person in this neighborhood who had the paperwork, the patience, and the legal right to make them sit back down. There are some inheritances that come in a lawyer's envelope. And then there are the kinds that come with overgrown grass, rusted hinges, and a story longer than the property lines. My grandfather's land was the second kind. He'd owned it since the early 60s, back when this whole area was nothing but pine trees, dirt roads, and a handful of cabins built by folks who knew how to use a hammer without calling a contractor. The lot sat at the edge of town, right near the ridge line, with a main house in front and a small guest cottage tucked behind a stand of old oaks. That guest house had once been used by traveling friends, fishing buddies, and at one point even an artist who paid rent in oil paintings. When Grandpa passed, he left the land to me. Not because I asked for it, but because, as he used to say, "You're the only one who understands that dirt matters." He was right. After years of city living, leases, and blinking security gates, the quiet of this land felt like home. I moved in within a month. The main house needed some updating, but the bones were solid. What caught my attention, though, was the guest house. It was weathered, sure. The roof had seen better days, and a raccoon had apparently taken up temporary residence in the attic. But the foundation was solid, the plumbing could be restored, and more importantly, it was legal. I dug through Grandpa's old files and found everything. The original 1964 permit, the plat map showing the structure clearly marked, and even a city inspection report from the early 2000s. I spent the first year fixing it up on weekends. New roof, fresh siding, rewired the electric, patched the septic. My plan was simple. Use it for guests, maybe rent a short term on occasion, but mostly just preserve the piece of my family's past. That was until the notice arrived. It came folded in half and taped to the side of the guest house door. HOA letterhead, bold red lettering. Cease and desist. Unauthorized secondary structure in violation of Covenant Code 14A. It was signed by a woman named Candace Weatherly, president of the High Ridge Estates HOA, whose border stopped exactly 14 feet before the back corner of my lot. The letter claimed that the guest house violated setback visibility standards, had not received board approval, and was not compatible with the character of the neighborhood. It ordered me to remove or demolish the structure within 30 days or face legal escalation. I stood there on the porch of that little house, holding the letter like it had come from another dimension. Because here's the thing, I wasn't in their neighborhood. Not legally, not structurally, not geographically. My address was on Elm Hollow Lane. Their HOA boundary, according to the maps, stopped halfway down the slope before my property even began. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I sent them a calm, well-documented reply. Dear HOA President Weatherly, thank you for your letter dated date. Please be advised that my property, located at address, falls outside the jurisdiction of the High Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. The structure in question, a guest house, is located entirely on my parcel and was legally permitted in 1964, with continued compliance through the years as per attached documentation. For your reference, I've included a certified copy of the parcel boundary, the original building permit, and the current zoning map from the City Planning Office. Should you need further clarification, I'd be happy to direct you to my property attorney or the city zoning administrator. Best, my name. I attached everything. The parcel map, permit copies, inspection records, and even a hand-drawn diagram showing how their boundary line stopped before the oaks. I mailed it certified. I emailed it too, just to be thorough. And I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 2 weeks later, a second letter arrived, this time more aggressive. It claimed I was refusing to comply with HOA visual standards, cited a completely different clause about auxiliary dwellings, and threatened to initiate legal proceedings if I didn't comply. No acknowledgement of my prior documentation. No mention of the boundaries I'd clearly laid out. Just more demands. And this time, they weren't just using letters. That weekend, I came home to find two members of the HOA standing on the edge of my driveway, arms crossed, pointing at the guest house. They didn't knock. They didn't introduce themselves. Just stood there like sentinels of suburbia. When I stepped out and asked if they needed something, one of them, a man with far too much starch in his collar, simply said, "You're not allowed to have that structure. It's an eyesore." I blinked. "It's been here longer than your HOA." "That doesn't matter," he snapped. "The board has determined." "No," I cut in. "What the board has determined doesn't apply here. Because this house," I pointed to the guest house, "sits on my land, not yours." He scoffed. "You can't just build what you want and ignore community cohesion." I nearly laughed. "Sir, I didn't build anything. This structure was permitted when your subdivision was still cow pasture. The law is older than your HOA covenants. You don't have control here." They left, muttering something about legal escalation. I went inside and immediately started digging. I pulled up the city assessor's records again, looked at the plat map, checked the survey markers along the ridge. I was right, and I wasn't just kind of right. I was legally bulletproof. The guest house was 100% within my property line. The HOA boundary was not only separate, it was affirmed by a recorded declaration of annexation from 1992, one that specifically excluded my parcel. I even called the city zoning office and spoke to a clerk named Lydia, who confirmed it with a laugh. "Oh yeah," she said, "you're outside their domain. They've tried to claim parts of that slope before. Doesn't hold up. You're good." So I sent another letter, this time with legal backing. I attached a copy of the 1992 annexation boundary, a notarized property line survey, and a written statement from the city zoning department confirming that the guest house was fully legal and outside HOA control. I CC'd the HOA board, the city attorney's office, and, just for good measure, the local newspaper's community affairs editor. The response? Silence. No reply. No phone call. No apology. But that didn't mean they were done. Because sometimes when people don't get their way through official channels, they resort to passive-aggressive nonsense. Over the next week, I noticed new things happening. HOA board members walking the perimeter of my fence and photographing the guest house from a street. A small drone hovering near the roof one morning, which buzzed off when I walked outside. An anonymous complaint filed with the city about illegal short-term rentals, even though I hadn't rented the guest house to a single soul. They weren't just being stubborn. They were waging a quiet war. But what they didn't realize, what they couldn't seem to wrap their perfectly manicured mind around, was that I wasn't going anywhere. Because when someone tries to erase your boundaries, the best response is to draw them darker. And I was just getting started at this point. It was no longer just about the guest house. It was about the principle. When someone tries to intimidate you with letters and made-up rules, and you push back with facts, and they still keep coming, it stops being a nuisance and becomes something else. A boundary war. And I had no intention of losing mine. After the second wave of threats, I decided to do something I hadn't done since college. Deep archival research. Not just zoning codes or survey flags. I wanted every scrap of legal paper that proved this land, this house, and this guest cottage had always stood outside their fence lines and fake authority. So I took a couple of days off work and made the Public Records Office my second home. I started with the original subdivision plat for High Ridge Estates, the same HOA trying to annex my guest house by attitude alone. The subdivision was recorded in 1992, 30 years after my grandfather had already built both the main house and the guest cottage. The neighborhood expanded in several phases, neatly defined and recorded with specific parcels and lot numbers. My land wasn't one of them. In fact, on the 1992 master map, my parcel, #37B, was shown in a pale gray tone with the words non-governed/legacy residential parcel, excluded from HOA overlay. That last part was the gold. It meant my property was explicitly carved out, a recognized exception during the time the HOA formed. A legacy parcel, which made their entire argument about architectural compliance not just wrong, but borderline fraudulent. But I didn't stop there. I found a 1964 building permit for the guest house, filed under my grandfather's name, with a stamp from the city's now-defunct Department of Residential Oversight. I also found a maintenance record from 1986, when new septic line had been laid for both houses. Every document showed 2 structures. Every drawing showed my boundaries. Every page screamed, "This was here first." To be sure I wasn't missing anything, I hired a licensed land surveyor to remark my parcel boundary. He placed new reflective flags and GPS markers along the ridgeline. When he finished, we stood together at the far edge of my property, right where the HOA president had pointed at the guest house and said, "This is ours." He chuckled. "She's not even close," he said, tapping his measuring stick. "They're a full 16 feet off." Armed with maps, permits, and boundary confirmation, I put together a formal document packet. I labeled it Boundary Clarification and Jurisdiction Review. Inside, I included original 1964 permit for the guest house, 1986 septic and inspection record, 1992 HOA subdivision plat with excluded parcel annotation, GPS certified survey report, City Zoning Department email confirming I was outside HOA control, a notarized affidavit from my neighbor whose property also bordered the HOA, confirming the guest house had existed for decades. Once I had everything printed and bound, I delivered a copy to the HOA board in person. Their next meeting was held in the clubhouse, the one that used to be a pool equipment shed until someone decided a podium and folding chairs made it official. I sat quietly until the public comment portion, then stood up and handed the packet to each board member, including Candace Weatherly, the self-appointed general of this paper war. "This is a complete jurisdictional review of my property, including the guest house," I said calmly. "Everything you've claimed is wrong. You're wasting your time and mine. And if this continues, I'll seek legal redress." Candace didn't even look down. She gave me a tight smile and said, "Thank you for your comments. The board will take it under advisement." I laughed out loud. Take it under advisement? That's not how jurisdiction works. You don't get a vote on what's yours. Murmurs broke out in the room. That was the first time I noticed other neighbors watching closely, some of them curious, others concerned. It turns out I wasn't the only one the HOA had targeted. But more on that later. The next day, I got an email from the board's compliance officer. It read, "While your packet was received, the board maintains that all structures within visual exposure of HOA-governed territory must comply with standards outlined in the Architectural Handbook, regardless of parcel inclusion. The board reserves the right to enforce cohesion policies where appropriate." I nearly fell on my chair laughing. Visual exposure? That wasn't in the handbook. That wasn't in any legal document. That was pure HOA fiction. And this fiction had gone too far. Because here's the thing. When someone starts making up rules, it usually means they're hiding something. So I started asking around. At first, it was casual, talking to neighbors on walks, waving at folks trimming hedges, striking up conversations at the community center. And I started hearing the same story over and over. They fined me for a shed I inherited from my parents, said it wasn't approved even though it was on the land before the HOA formed. They told me my property line looked ambiguous and forced me to move a fence that's been in the same spot for 20 years. I asked for the boundary maps. They said it wasn't my place to question it. That last one really got me, because it meant the board wasn't just mistaken. They were actively misrepresenting their authority. And so, I made another packet. This one was titled Boundary Overreach Summary, Pattern of HOA Misrepresentation. I compiled a timeline of cases where the HOA had pushed its control outside legal limits. I interviewed 2 families who had paid fines they didn't legally owe. I included 3 affidavits, more maps, and a recommendation that the city investigate HOA misapplication of governance. Then, I contacted a local property rights watchdog group. They were thrilled. Most of these cases go unchallenged, one of their attorneys told me. We've seen HOAs do this in new developments where homeowners assume the rules are legit. But if you have the deed and the maps, they've got nothing. We held a small community meeting at the local library. I brought printed boundary maps. The lawyer gave a talk on HOA limits. About 20 people showed up. By the end of the night, people were asking questions like, "Can I get my fine refunded? Can they undo my fence order? What else have they been lying about?" Word spread fast. Candace and her board tried to run damage control, claimed I was inciting confusion, that I was jeopardizing community harmony. But the harmony was already gone. And the confusion? It wasn't mine. It was theirs. Because while they were playing neighborhood Monopoly, I was reading the deed. And there's no square on that board that overrides actual property LAW. To be why this point, I had proof. I had maps. I had public records, sworn affidavits, and zoning confirmation. But one thing I didn't yet have, a little legal muscle. Because facts are powerful, but a well-placed letter from a lawyer that speaks their language. So I called them back up. Through the property rights group I've been talking to, I was introduced to a local attorney named Jenna Moreland. She specialized in real estate boundary disputes and HOA overreach cases. The kind of lawyer who didn't flinch when someone waved a copy of a community standards manual at her like it was the Constitution. She took one look at the documents I brought in, the land plat, the original permit, the HOA's threat letters, and just smiled. "This isn't a gray area," she said. "This is crystal clear. They're bluffing. Worse, they're acting outside their legal authority. You've got a strong case for harassment." She drafted a formal letter and sent it to the HOA within 48 hours. Certified mail, return receipt requested. And just in case they wanted to ignore it like they had my previous documents, she sent copies to the city zoning department and the county land commissioner. The letter was titled, "Formal Notice of Boundary Harassment and Unauthorized Enforcement Attempts." It included a demand for immediate cessation of contact and removal of all enforcement threats, a citation of the HOA's recorded boundaries from the 1992 subdivision plat, a detailed history of their knowingly false claims, a warning that any further actions would be considered targeted harassment under local civil code. And just like that, the silence became louder. No letter, no email, not even a voicemail. Then, 5 days later, a white pickup truck from the city's property inspection office pulled into my driveway. Out stepped a senior inspector named Ed, friendly guy, wore a ball cap that said, "Zoning is sexy," which honestly was a first. "I got your file," he said. "City wants an official review since the HOA keeps poking this fire. Mind if I walk the line?" "Be my guest," I said. The survey markers are still up. He spent about 20 minutes walking the property edge, double-checking every flag, comparing coordinates with his tablet. Ranger, my dog, walked beside him like a furry survey assistant. When Ed came back, he was already shaking his head. "This whole guest house," he said, "in a good chunk of your front yard, completely outside HOA jurisdiction. They've got no claim, not even a visual one." I raised an eyebrow. "Visual? Yeah, I saw their last letter. They're trying to argue aesthetics now. Visual impact. That's not a thing. Not when it's off their map." I laughed. He did too. "Do me a favor," Ed said as he packed up. "If they send you anything else, forward it to the city attorney. We've had complaints about this HOA before." And that was the moment I realized something had shifted. This wasn't just about my guest house anymore. This was about their credibility and their abuse of authority. A week later, a letter finally arrived from the HOA. Not handwritten, not aggressive. This one came printed on the official letterhead, still stiff and formal, but quieter somehow. "Dear Mr. My name. After further review and consultation with local officials, the board acknowledges that your property, including the secondary dwelling structure, lies outside the jurisdictional boundaries of High Ridge Estates. As such, we formally retract previous correspondence regarding compliance and enforcement, and we apologize for any inconvenience caused. We appreciate your understanding as we work to clarify and update our internal records. Sincerely, Candace Weatherly, President, High Ridge Estates HOA." I read it 3 times. No threats, no demands, no mention of community harmony, just an admission. They backed down, and that, right there, was the turning point. The day after I received the letter, Naomi, my neighbor from 2 houses over, knocked on my door holding a Tupperware container of lemon bars. "You saw it?" she asked. "The apology?" "Yeah. They finally admitted you were right." "Only took them 3 months," I said, grinning. She handed me the container. I thought this might taste better than a victory dance on your porch. We both laughed. But the truth was, it did feel like a victory. Not just for me, for the neighborhood. Because once the board admitted they'd overreached, everything started unraveling. Other neighbors who had once been hesitant, maybe even skeptical of me, began knocking on my door. Some came with questions about their own lot lines. Some came with copies of citations they had received and wanted help interpreting. One guy even brought a six-pack and said, "I never liked that guest house, but I like bullies even less." Support began to shift. The HOA board, once iron-fisted and confident, started holding meetings behind closed doors. Their compliance patrols stopped. The drone, the one that had hovered near my guest house, never returned. At the next quarterly HOA meeting, attendance tripled. And when one resident asked, "Are there any other homes the board has targeted that fall outside our authority?" the silence said everything. A motion was introduced to hire an independent surveyor to re-verify the HOA boundary map. It passed unanimously. The surveyor's findings confirmed what I already knew and added even more fuel to the fire. Several homes that had been governed by the HOA for years were, in fact, only partially within the overlay. Some weren't in it at all. And yet, they had been fined, cited, and controlled. One woman, elderly, sweet, barely 5 feet tall, stood up with tears in her eyes and held up a $500 violation notice she'd received for having unapproved porch furniture. "I paid this," she said quietly. "I thought I didn't have a choice." The board didn't respond. Couldn't respond. It was over. The city issued a statement confirming that all future HOA enforcement must be preceded by proper boundary review. The HOA itself was forced to hold a special vote to revise its internal maps and reissue compliance standards that clearly identified jurisdictional lines. And my guest house? It remained exactly where it had always been, perched behind the oaks, peaceful and proud. A reminder that the land doesn't lie. That titles and permits and survey flags aren't just paperwork, they're shields. And when someone tries to step over your boundary, sometimes you need to let those documents do the talking. The board's retraction didn't come with a handshake. There was no "we were wrong" in bold print. But the silence that followed, that was louder than any apology. And in the end, that guest house stood taller than it had in years. Some victories are loud. Courtroom slams, viral headlines, dramatic reversals. Mine came in the form of silence. The kind of silence that settles after months of posturing. After letterhead threats, sidewalk standoffs, and folded arms across false fences. The kind of silence that happens when the people who picked a fight realize everyone's watching them, and not in a good way. After the HOA's formal retraction, the mood around the neighborhood changed. It wasn't overnight, but it was obvious. You could feel it in the way people paused longer at community bulletin boards, in the awkward glances exchanged at mailbox clusters, in the sudden disappearance of clipboard patrols and committee drive-bys. It all boiled over the next full HOA meeting. The clubhouse was packed, standing room only, neighbors fanning themselves with printed agendas. And for once, they weren't there for bingo. Candace Weatherly, the woman who had personally signed every threat letter and denied every fact I'd sent her, stood at the front, flanked by a board that looked more like a jury than a team. When she tried to open the meeting with the usual dry report about landscaping schedules, someone in the back stood up and asked, "When do we talk about the guest house?" You could hear the breath catch in the room. Candace blinked. "That matter has been resolved." "No," a younger man near the middle said, arms crossed. "That matter was created by this board, and a whole lot of us want to know how many other matters you've gotten wrong." The next hour unraveled like a documentary in real time. Residents shared stories, fines, citations, and so-called compliance visits that had all been based on incorrect boundary assumptions. One woman admitted she'd painted her garage 3 different times trying to avoid visual disruption notices, only to discover her home sat on a grandfather parcel never under HOA governance. And when someone asked whether the board had ever formally reviewed the jurisdiction maps before sending those letters, Candace muttered, "We were operating on tradition." That was her undoing. By the end of the meeting, 2 board members publicly called for Candace's resignation. One even admitted he'd been uncomfortable with the aggressive compliance tactics, but was pressured to toe the line. She resigned the next morning. Not with grace, not with an apology, just a one-paragraph email about needing more time for personal projects. The board quickly moved to cover its tracks. A vote was held to commission an independent land survey of the entire subdivision. This time, it wasn't optional. When the survey results came back, they weren't kind. Several parcels had been misclassified. Some lots had been unfairly subjected to enforcement for years. A few homeowners who had paid violation fines received letters offering refunds and formal apologies. And as for my property, a new, permanent boundary marker was installed at the edge of the easement, a metal post with GPS coordinates and a reflective tag that left no room for interpretation. HOA here, not HOA there. Clear, final, undeniable. But perhaps the most satisfying part? My guest house, the one they tried to erase, became a symbol. Neighbors started calling it the Line House. One family asked if they could use it for a small community gathering. A local journalist wrote a feature called Drawing the Line, how one property owner quietly changed a neighborhood. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about recognition, about standing up calmly and firmly when someone pushes too far. And as spring rolled in, I noticed something else. Peace. No more letters. No more visits. No more drama. People waved more, said hello. Some even apologized, not for siding with the board, but for staying silent while it played out. The land felt quiet again. Honest. I'd always thought my grandfather left me this place because he trusted me to take care of it. Now I realized, maybe he left it to me because he knew I'd protect it. And I did. With paperwork. With patience. And with the kind of calm defiance that doesn't need a hammer. Just the truth and a strong foundation. Sometimes the boldest line isn't drawn in red ink. It's already sitting there in the deeds and records. In coordinates, maps, survey pins, and signatures. The HOA just didn't bother to look before they tried to bulldoze their way in. They assumed that silence meant surrender. That proximity meant control. That a clipboard and a committee could somehow override decades of law, history, and ownership. But land doesn't lie. And this time, the boundary they crossed didn't bend. It pushed back. See, when someone tries to control what they don't own, you don't need to yell. You don't need to match their arrogance or their letters. You just show them the paper that says otherwise and let the boundary speak for itself. Because fences may keep people out, but lines define the truth. And the more clearly they're drawn, the less noise you need to make. Now that guest house stands not just as a structure, but as a symbol, that knowledge still wins, that records still matter, and that no amount of visual cohesion justifies erasing what was never theirs to claim. So let's hear your story. Have you ever had a neighbor, or an HOA, try to enforce power over something they didn't actually own? Drop it in the comments. Let's compare deed-sized receipts, because sometimes the best response to control is calm, confident clarity, and maybe a boundary line etched in stone.